The streets of New York City were eerily quiet that night, the kind of silence only a snowstorm could bring. Flakes of snow fell steadily, blanketing the city in white, while streetlights cast a soft glow over the icy sidewalks. James Bennett, a man accustomed to the hum of Wall Street and the clinking of crystal glasses at high-profile galas, was far from his usual surroundings. Seated behind the wheel of his black luxury SUV, James tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the traffic light to change. His thoughts wandered to the late-night meeting he had just left, another discussion about balancing profits with philanthropy. Though he'd built a reputation as a man of numbers, there was a quiet part of him that craved something more meaningful, something he couldn't quite name. As the light turned green, his gaze caught a figure hunched on the sidewalk, barely visible against the snow. A woman, wrapped in a thin coat, sat trembling beside a brick wall. Her head was bowed low, arms tightly hugging her knees, as if trying to shrink away from the unforgiving cold. The sight made James instinctively slow down, his foot hovering over the brake. "Keep driving," he muttered under his breath, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled to the curb, his mind racing. What was he doing? He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, especially at this hour. Rolling down the window slightly, he leaned out. "Hey, are you all right?" The woman didn't answer. She only glanced up briefly, her eyes wary and hollow. Before looking away again, James hesitated, then stepped out into the biting cold. His polished shoes crunching against the snow, he approached cautiously, hands raised slightly, as if to reassure her he meant no harm. "Miss," he said gently, "it's freezing out here. Let me take you somewhere warm." Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," James replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's common sense. You'll freeze to death out here." The woman looked at him again, her eyes narrowing. She seemed to weigh his words carefully, as though deciding whether to trust him. Finally, with a reluctant nod, she allowed him to help her to her feet, up close. James noticed how frail she seemed, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her coat. The drive to his home was silent. James stole occasional glances at her through the rearview mirror, noting the way she stared out the window, her expression unreadable. There was something about her, an air of resilience mixed with vulnerability, that he couldn't quite place. When they arrived at his mansion in Manhattan, James felt a pang of awkwardness. His home was a stark contrast to the woman he'd just brought inside. Towering ceilings, marble floors, and an opulent chandelier that cast golden light across the entryway. She stood there stiffly, her shoes leaving wet prints on the pristine floor. "Linda," James called, and moments later, his longtime housekeeper appeared. She was a stout woman with kind eyes who had worked for James since before his wife's passing. "Please prepare a room for our guest," he instructed, then turned back to the woman. "What's your name?" "Natalie," she said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Natalie," James said, offering a reassuring nod. "Linda will help you settle in. Let me know if you need anything." Natalie looked up at him, her expression softening just slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. "You're very kind," as she followed Linda up the grand staircase. Natalie glanced over her shoulder at James, her lips curving into a faint, enigmatic smile. "But soon," she added cryptically, "you'll discover that not everything is as it seems." The words lingered in the air long after she disappeared up the stairs. James frowned, replaying her tone in his head. What did she mean by that? Shaking his head, he decided to let it go for now. Later that evening, James found himself in his study, nursing a glass of scotch as he stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth of the room couldn't quite thaw the unease that Natalie's parting words had left behind. He told himself it was nothing, a tired woman's musings after a difficult night. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival would change more than just the course of his evening. As the clock chimed midnight, James finally stood, stretching his stiff shoulders. He decided to check on Natalie before retiring for the night. Quietly climbing the stairs, he reached the guest room and knocked softly. When there was no response, he cracked the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the borrowed clothes folded on the edge of the mattress. James scanned the space, noting the open window letting in a gust of icy wind. She was gone, His jaw tightened as a wave of confusion and frustration rolled over him. Why would she leave after everything? And how had she disappeared without anyone noticing? Turning away from the empty room, James resolved to find answers. He didn't know who Natalie was or what she wanted, but one thing was certain. Her presence wasn't a coincidence. Morning light filtered through the large windows of the Bennett mansion, casting long shadows over the marble floors. James Bennett sat at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee in silence. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the previous night. Natalie's cryptic words and her sudden disappearance lingered like an unresolved puzzle, one he couldn't ignore. Linda entered the dining room, carrying a tray of fresh croissants. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed James's distracted demeanor. She set the tray down and folded her hands in front of her apron. "Is everything all right, Mr. Bennett? You seem preoccupied." James set his mug down with a sigh. "Natalie, she's gone." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I checked her room last night before going to bed. It was empty. The window was open. She just left." Linda frowned, clearly unsettled. "That's odd. She seemed so tired when I helped her to the room. Did she say anything to you before she left?" James hesitated. "Only something cryptic about things not being what they seem. I thought it was nothing, but now I'm not so sure." Linda nodded slowly. "Actually, sir, I almost forgot. She left something for you." James's brows knitted together. "What do you mean?" "She handed me an envelope before she left. Said you'd know what to do with it." Linda reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. She handed it to James, whose fingers felt a strange tension as he took it. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I didn't think it was urgent," Linda said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "I assumed she'd explain herself when she came back." James sighed and gestured dismissively. "It's fine. Let me see what this is." The envelope was unmarked, its contents thick and uneven. Carefully, James tore it open, pulling out a single handwritten note and a small photograph. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes fell on the image. It was a photo of Rebecca, his late wife. She stood smiling warmly, her arm wrapped around a young girl with strikingly familiar features. The girl was unmistakably Natalie. James's chest tightened as memories of Rebecca flooded back. Her laugh, her kindness, her quiet resilience. And now, this hidden connection he had never known about. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter. "Auntie, alive, dear James, I don't blame you for not recognizing me. It's been years since I last saw Rebecca, and time has changed both of us in ways we never could have imagined. What hasn't changed is the love I had for my sister, and the pain of losing her. I didn't come to you for pity or for charity. I came because, after years of searching, I finally found the last connection to Rebecca that remains. You and Matthew. Rebecca never told you about me because she was protecting me. Our childhood was complicated, to say the least. After our parents died, we were separated. She ended up with relatives who could give her opportunities, while I was sent to live with people who barely tolerated my existence. I tried to find her for years, but by the time I did, it was too late. When I saw you last night, I recognized you immediately. Rebecca spoke so highly of you in the letters she used to send me before her death. She said you were a kind, compassionate man, and I see now that she wasn't wrong. Thank you for your kindness, but I can't stay. I need time to process everything. I've left the photograph so you know this isn't a lie. Take care of Matthew. He's Rebecca's legacy, and he deserves to grow up surrounded by love. Natalie." James read the letter twice, his mind racing to piece together the implications. He felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt for not knowing about Natalie sooner, anger at Rebecca for keeping this secret, and an overwhelming sadness for everything both women had endured. "Is something wrong, Mr. Bennett?" Linda asked cautiously. Noticing the pallor on his face, James handed her the photograph without a word. Linda took one look and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's Mrs. Rebecca," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And is that Natalie?" James nodded slowly. "Apparently, she's Rebecca's sister. I had no idea." Linda sank into the chair across from him, her face etched with disbelief. "Why would she hide something like this from you?" "I don't know," James admitted. but I intend to find out. Later that morning, James found Matthew playing in the garden, his laughter carrying through the crisp air. The boy's energy was infectious. But James couldn't shake the weight of the photograph and letter in his pocket. "Dad, look what I found," Matthew called, running up to him. In his small hands, he held a pressed flower encased in glass. It was a keepsake from Rebecca's belongings, something James hadn't seen in years. "Where did you find that?" James asked. Kneeling to Matthew's level, "In the box with all Mom's things," Matthew said innocently. "Can we look through it together later?" James hesitated. The box held memories he hadn't touched since Rebecca's passing. But now, with Natalie's letter and photo resurfacing old wounds, it seemed like the right time. "Yeah, buddy," he said, ruffling Matthew's hair. "We'll do that." That evening, James sat alone in his study. The photograph and letter spread out on the desk before him. He stared at Rebecca's face in the photo, searching for answers she could no longer give. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of his place in the life he had built. If Rebecca had kept something so monumental from him, what else had he missed? The question hung heavy in his mind. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let Natalie slip away again. She was a part of Rebecca's story, a part of Matthew's heritage, and now, a part of his. He needed to find her, not just for answers, but to make things right. The sun dipped below the New York skyline as James Bennett stood in the quiet sanctuary of his late wife's study. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, in every detail. From the worn leather armchair by the window to the neatly organized shelves, bore Rebecca's touch. It had been years since he had stepped inside, and now, with Natalie's letter weighing heavily on his mind, it felt like the only place to start. A wooden box sat on the desk, its lid slightly ajar, revealing an array of keepsakes Rebecca had treasured. James hesitated before lifting the lid, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The first item he retrieved was a small journal bound in faded blue leather. It was one of Rebecca's many notebooks, where she often scribbled thoughts, recipes, and dreams. Flipping through the pages, James found fragments of her life preserved in delicate handwriting. Then, toward the back, a single entry caught his eye. June 12th. I can't stop thinking about her. About Natalie. It's been so many years since I last saw her, but the guilt never fades. I keep wondering if I did the right thing, leaving her behind. She deserved so much better than what she got. I hope she's safe. I hope she knows I never stopped loving her. James sat back in the chair, the journal trembling in his hands. This was more than just a passing mention. Rebecca had carried this pain with her for years, silently mourning the sister she had lost. But why had she never told him? Why had she kept such a significant part of her life hidden? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Linda appeared in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "I figured you might be in here," she said softly. "Matthew's asleep, but he was asking about you." James nodded absently. "Thanks, Linda. I'll check on him soon." Linda lingered, her gaze falling on the journal in James's hands. "You found something, didn't you?" "She wrote about Natalie," James said, his voice distant. "She missed her. She wanted to find her, but she never told me." Linda moved closer, her eyes scanning the room. Rebecca was a private person. Maybe she didn't know how to bring it up. James exhaled slowly, setting the journal aside. "Private, yes, but this is huge, Linda. How could she keep something like this from me?" Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it wasn't about hiding it from you. Maybe it was about protecting Natalie. It sounds like she went through a lot." James rubbed his temples, trying to ease the tension building there. "I need to find Natalie. I can't let this be another chapter of Rebecca's life that ends in silence." The next morning, James made a few phone calls, tapping into the network of resources he had built over years in business. One of his contacts, a private investigator, agreed to help track down Natalie with the photo and limited information James had. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. By midday, James decided to visit an old friend who had known Rebecca during their college years. Dr. Alan Pearson was a retired professor who now spent his days tending to a small bookstore in Greenwich Village. The place smelled of aged paper and freshly brewed coffee, a comforting combination that eased some of James's nerves. Alan greeted him warmly, his lined face breaking into a smile. "James, it's been a while. To what do I owe the pleasure? They exchanged pleasantries before James cut to the chase. Alan, I need to ask you something about Rebecca. The professor's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. Of course. What's on your mind? Did she ever mention a sister? James asked, his voice low but steady. Someone named Natalie? Alan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Natalie, yes. She mentioned her once or twice, but it was always brief, like it was too painful to talk about. I gathered that they were separated when they were young. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Do you know why? Alan shook his head. Not exactly. Rebecca only said that their parents' deaths left them in the care of different relatives. She told me she regretted not being able to find Natalie later in life. Why are you asking about this now? James hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his pocket. Sliding it across the table, Alan studied it carefully, his expression softening. She looks just like Rebecca, Alan murmured. This is Natalie, isn't it? Yes, James said. She showed up outside my house 2 nights ago. She told me who she was. But before I could process any of it, she disappeared. Alan leaned back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Rebecca was a remarkable woman, James. If Natalie is anything like her, you're lucky to have found her. Don't let her slip away again. As James left the bookstore, Alan's words echoed in his mind. He couldn't let Natalie slip away, not when she was the last remaining piece of Rebecca's story. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was the investigator. We've got a lead, the man said briskly. Your Natalie Harper has been seen volunteering at a women's shelter in Brooklyn. It's called Haven House. James's pulse quickened. Are you sure it's her? Positive. She's been working there under that name for a few months now. Send me the address, James said. Already turning toward his car, he didn't know what he would say when he saw Natalie again. But one thing was clear. This time, he wouldn't let her walk away without answers. The streets of Brooklyn felt a world away from the polished corners of Manhattan, the sleek skyscrapers and quiet. Well-manicured neighborhoods James was accustomed to were replaced with narrow roads, aging buildings, and the bustle of a community that seemed to pulse with resilience. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he navigated through unfamiliar territory. His focus split between the directions on his GPS and the thoughts swirling in his mind. He pulled up in front of a modest brick building with a small sign that read, Haven House, Women's Shelter. The place exuded a quiet sense of refuge, its unassuming facade contrasting sharply with the grandiosity of his mansion. James parked his car and took a moment to collect himself. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, but there was no turning back now. Inside, the warmth of the shelter enveloped him. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of cleaning products. A few women sat in the common area, chatting softly, while a volunteer sorted through donations in the corner. James approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with a kind smile greeted him. Can I help you? She asked. Yes, I'm looking for Natalie Harper, James replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I believe she works here. The woman's smile faltered slightly. Natalie isn't here at the moment. She's out running errands for the shelter. Can I leave her a message? James hesitated. Part of him wanted to wait, but he also didn't want to impose on a place that clearly served a vital purpose. Could you let her know that James Bennett stopped by? I'd really like to speak with her. The woman nodded, jotting down his name on a notepad. Of course. Is there a way she can contact you? He handed her his business card, feeling a twinge of awkwardness as she glanced at the embossed lettering and his unmistakably prestigious title. The woman's eyes flicked back up to him, her curiosity evident, but she said nothing. Thank you, James said. Stepping back toward the door, as he reached for the handle, the woman called out, Wait a moment, Mr. Bennett. She rummaged through a small stack of papers on the desk before pulling out a clipboard. Natalie left a note for the staff this morning. Maybe it's a coincidence, but she mentioned going to St. John's Park later today. It's not far from here. James's heart leapt at the prospect of finding her. Thank you, he said, his voice more earnest now. I really appreciate it. The park was quiet when James arrived, its paths lined with benches and trees that had shed most of their leaves. Children played on the swings while their parents chatted nearby. James scanned the area, his gaze moving from face to face until he spotted her. Natalie sat alone on a bench near the edge of the park, her head bowed as she stared at her hands. She looked different in the daylight, more vulnerable, yet still carrying the air of quiet strength that had struck him before. Taking a deep breath, James approached, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. "Natalie," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she sighed and shifted slightly on the bench, making room for him to sit. "You found me," she said, her tone more resigned than accusatory. "I had to," James replied, taking the seat beside her. "You left without giving me a chance to understand." Natalie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled her coat tighter around her, as though shielding herself from the questions she knew were coming. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want to know?" James turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Everything. Rebecca never told me she had a sister. Why didn't she tell me? Why did you disappear?" Natalie let out a bitter laugh. "Rebecca didn't tell you because she thought she was protecting me. After our parents died, we were split up. She went to live with relatives who had money, and I didn't. The family I ended up with didn't want me. They tolerated me, but they didn't love me." Her voice cracked, and she paused to steady herself. "Rebecca tried to keep in touch at first. She wrote letters, called when she could, but as she got older, she felt guilty, like she had abandoned me. When she married you, I think she was afraid of bringing her past into your life." James frowned, his chest tightening at the thought of Rebecca carrying such a heavy burden. "That doesn't make sense," he said gently. I loved her. I would have understood." Natalie shrugged. "Maybe, but she didn't believe that at the time, and by the time I found out where she was living, she was gone." Her voice softened, and she glanced down at her hands. "When I saw you that night, I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to tell you everything right then and there, but I was afraid. I wasn't sure if you'd even believe me." James reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph Natalie had left behind. He handed it to her, and she smiled faintly as her fingers traced the edges. "I found this with Rebecca's things," he said. "She kept it all these years, and I found a journal where she wrote about you, about how much she missed you." Natalie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she quickly looked away. "She was a good sister," she said softly. "Better than I deserved." "That's not true," James said firmly. "You were important to her, and you're important to me now, too." Natalie turned to him, her expression guarded. "Why? You don't even know me." "Because you're family," James replied without hesitation. "And family is something I can't ignore, not after losing Rebecca." For the first time, Natalie's walls seemed to crack. She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," she admitted. "It's been so long since I had anyone." "You don't have to decide right now," James said gently. "But I'd like you to come back to the house, meet Matthew properly, take some time to see what we can build together." Natalie hesitated, but then she smiled faintly. "All right," she said. "I'll give it a try." The drive back to the Bennett mansion was quiet, but it wasn't the awkward silence James feared. Natalie sat beside him, her gaze fixed out the window, as if trying to take in every detail of the bustling city around them. Occasionally, James glanced at her, noting the faint tension in her posture and the way her hands gripped the edge of her seat. "You're nervous," he said gently, breaking the silence. Natalie turned to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I guess I am. It's just, I don't know what to expect." James nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "Neither do I. But this isn't about expectations. It's about family, Natalie. That's what Rebecca would have wanted." Her expression softened at the mention of her sister, and she turned back to the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you're right." As the car pulled into the long driveway of the Bennett estate, Natalie's eyes widened. The sprawling mansion loomed ahead, its pristine facade glistening in the late afternoon sun. She shifted uncomfortably, her hands fiddling with the strap of her bag. "This is where you live?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. James chuckled softly. "It's a bit much." "I know. Rebecca always said the same thing, but it's home." The car came to a stop, and Linda appeared at the front door, her ever-present apron neatly tied around her waist. Her eyes flicked between James and Natalie, her curiosity evident, but her demeanor professional as always. "Welcome back, Mr. Bennett," Linda said, before turning her attention to Natalie. "And you must be Natalie. It's nice to meet you properly." Natalie managed a polite smile, though James could sense her unease. "Thank you, it's nice to be here." "Matthew's in the garden," Linda said to James. "He's been asking about you." "Perfect," James replied. He glanced at Natalie. "Come on, there's someone I want you to meet." The garden was bathed in golden light, with neatly trimmed hedges and bursts of colorful flowers lining the paths. Matthew was kneeling on the grass near the fountain, engrossed in a small toy robot he was trying to assemble. His laughter bubbled up as the mechanical arms moved on their own for the first time. "Matthew," James called, his voice warm. The boy's head shot up, and a wide grin spread across his face as he scrambled to his feet. "Dad, look, it works." "That's great, buddy," James said, ruffling Matthew's hair as the boy threw his arms around him. "I want you to meet someone." Matthew stepped back, his curious eyes shifting to Natalie. He tilted his head, studying her with the unfiltered honesty of a child. "Who's she?" "This is Natalie," James said. She's family." Matthew's face lit up. "Really? Like an aunt or something?" Natalie knelt to his level, her smile more genuine now. "Something like that." Matthew's grin widened, and he held up his toy robot. "Do you want to see what I made? It's super cool." "I'd love to," Natalie replied, and James watched as she and Matthew began to chat, the initial awkwardness melting away. Natalie's laugh, soft and unguarded, filled the air as Matthew proudly demonstrated the robot's moves. For the first time in days, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. Later that evening, the three of them sat around the dining table, a simple but delicious meal prepared by Linda spread before them. Matthew animatedly recounted his day at school, his stories punctuated by bursts of laughter. Natalie listened intently, her face lighting up with each of his tales. "Matthew," James said, as the boy reached for another slice of bread, "what do you think about Natalie staying with us for a little while?" Matthew's eyes widened. "Really? She's gonna live here. That's the idea," James replied, glancing at Natalie for confirmation. Natalie hesitated, the weight of the decision evident in her expression. "If that's all right with you, Matthew," she said softly. "Of course it is," Matthew exclaimed. "It'll be so cool to have more family around." Natalie smiled, a flicker of relief passing over her face. "Thank you." As the evening wound down, Matthew was sent off to bed, leaving James and Natalie alone in the sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. James poured himself a glass of scotch and offered Natalie a cup of tea, which she accepted. "You were great with him," James said, taking a seat across from her. Natalie wrapped her hands around the steaming mug, her gaze distant. "He's a good kid. Reminds me of Rebecca in a way." James nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, he has her eyes, her curiosity." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Natalie spoke again. "I wasn't sure about this," she admitted. "Coming back here, but Matthew, he made it feel right." James leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "This is your home now, Natalie. You don't have to feel like an outsider." Her eyes met his, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you, James, for everything." "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank Rebecca. She's the one who made all of this possible." Natalie's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "I think she'd be proud of us." James raised his glass. "To Rebecca and to new beginnings." Natalie lifted her cup in agreement, a sense of quiet resolve settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to belong. Morning light streamed through the large windows of the Bennett mansion as Natalie sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread filled the air, courtesy of Linda, who bustled around the kitchen humming softly. Natalie watched her, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and unease. She still wasn't entirely sure how she fit into this picture-perfect household. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Matthew's excited footsteps echoing down the hall. He burst into the kitchen, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a grin plastered across his face. "Aunt Natalie," he exclaimed, as if the title had been cemented overnight. "You've got to see the science project we're doing at school today. We're building volcanoes that actually explode." Natalie smiled. her heart warming at his enthusiasm. "That sounds amazing. Do you think you'll win?" "Totally," Matthew declared confidently, grabbing a piece of toast. "Dad says he'll pick me up early so we can work on it together at home. Maybe you can help too." Natalie blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. "Me? Yeah," Matthew said, his tone as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're part of the family now, right?" Linda shot Natalie a knowing look over her shoulder, her hands busy kneading dough. "Looks like you've been officially adopted." Natalie laughed softly, though the word family stirred emotions she wasn't quite ready to face. "I'll try not to mess up the volcano then." Later that morning, James found Natalie in the library, flipping through one of the many books that lined the tall shelves. He leaned against the doorway, observing her for a moment before speaking. "Matthew really likes having you around," he said. Natalie turned, a slight smile on her lips. "He's a great kid, smart, funny. You've done a good job with him." James stepped into the room, his expression softening. "I've tried, but he's missed out on so much. On having a mother, on knowing the rest of his family. That's why having you here means so much to me." Natalie closed the book, her fingers running along the worn cover. "I'm still figuring out where I fit in all this, James. It feels overwhelming." "I get that," James admitted, taking a seat across from her. "But you don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take it day by day." She nodded, though her uncertainty lingered. "It's been so long since I've had anything like this. A family, a home. This is your home now," James said firmly. "And as far as family goes, Matthew's already made his decision. He adores you." Natalie's smile grew a little wider at that. "He's made it hard not to adore him back." And the afternoon was spent in the garden, where Matthew eagerly showed Natalie how to assemble the parts for his science project. James watched from a distance, letting them bond without interference. Natalie seemed more at ease with Matthew, her laughter coming more freely as they worked together to perfect the miniature volcano. When it came time to test their creation, Natalie stood back as Matthew poured the vinegar into the baking soda-filled crater. The eruption of fizz and foam drew delighted cheers from the boy, and Natalie clapped along with him. "You're a natural at this," James remarked as he approached them, a grin tugging at his lips. "Don't give me too much credit," Natalie replied. "Matthew's the brains of the operation." Matthew beamed. "Dad, can Aunt Natalie come to the science fair next week?" James glanced at Natalie, his expression hopeful. "What do you say?" Natalie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'd love to." That evening, as the house settled into its usual calm, Natalie found herself standing in Rebecca's old study. She hadn't meant to end up there, but something had drawn her to the space. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and the shelves were lined with mementos and books that spoke to the woman Rebecca had been. Her fingers brushed over a small photo frame on the desk. It was a picture of Rebecca, James, and Matthew, taken during a family trip, judging by the beach in the background. Rebecca's smile was radiant, and Natalie felt a pang of loss as she stared at her sister's face. "You miss her," James said from the doorway, his voice gentle. Natalie turned, startled. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," James assured her, stepping into the room. "This was Rebecca's favorite place. She'd want you to feel welcome here." Natalie set the photo back down carefully. "She was so happy with you, I can see it in her eyes." "She made me happy too," James said quietly. "But she carried so much that I didn't know about. I wish she'd told me more about you." Natalie looked down, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "She probably thought it was too late, that I'd disappeared for good. But you didn't," James said, his tone firm. "You're here now, and that's what matters." Natalie met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for saying that." "Don't thank me," James replied. "Just promise me you'll give yourself a chance to belong here." For the first time in a long while, Natalie allowed herself to believe that maybe she could. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Bennett mansion's sitting room, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden floors. Natalie sat on the plush couch, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The house was unusually quiet, with Matthew already off to school and James attending to business calls in his study. It gave her time to think, a luxury she wasn't entirely comfortable with. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. James appeared in the doorway, a small, leather-bound book in his hand. His expression was calm, but serious, as though he'd been rehearsing what he was about to say. "I found something," he said, stepping into the room. "Something I think you should see." Natalie placed her cup on the coffee table and straightened in her seat. "What is it?" James hesitated before handing her the book. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. The initials RB were embossed in faded gold on the front. "It's Rebecca's diary," James said softly. "I found it a few days ago while going through her things. I thought about keeping it to myself." "But you deserve to read it." Natalie's breath caught as she opened the book. The pages were filled with Rebecca's familiar handwriting, neat and deliberate, as if each word had been carefully chosen. She flipped through the entries, her heart pounding as she caught glimpses of phrases that spoke of love, loss, and longing. "Why are you giving this to me?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's not just my story to tell," James replied. "Rebecca wrote about you, about how much she missed you, how much she regretted not being able to protect you. I think she'd want you to know that." Natalie swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "There's no rush," James said gently. "Take your time, but when you're ready, I think you'll find the answers you've been looking for." That afternoon, Natalie sat in the quiet of Rebecca's study. The diary resting on her lap, she traced her fingers over the cover before finally mustering the courage to open it. The scent of old paper wafted up as she turned to the first entry. March 3rd. It's been years since I last saw Natalie, but I still think about her every day. I wonder where she is, what she's doing. If she's happy, I wish I could go back and change everything, keep us together somehow. But the past feels like a weight I'll never be able to lift. Natalie's chest tightened as she read the words, her emotions swinging between grief and a bittersweet sense of validation. She flipped to another entry, her fingers trembling. June 15th. James doesn't know about Natalie. I've thought about telling him, but where would I even start? It feels like too much to unload on him, on us. I love James, but some parts of my past feel too tangled to untie. Maybe one day, I'll find the courage to tell him everything. Tears blurred her vision, and Natalie wiped them away hastily. She could feel Rebecca's presence in the words, as if her sister were sitting beside her, speaking directly to her heart. The next entry hit her even harder. Gia, September 8th. If something ever happens to me, I hope James finds Natalie. He has a good heart, and I know he'll do the right thing. Natalie deserves to know she was never forgotten. Natalie closed the diary, unable to read further. The weight of Rebecca's love and regret pressed down on her, leaving her breathless. She leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Later that evening, James found Natalie sitting by the fireplace, the diary still in her lap. He approached cautiously, sensing the emotional toll the day had taken on her. "Did you read it?" he asked gently. Natalie nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I did, and," James prompted, his voice steady but soft. "She never forgot me," Natalie said, her voice breaking. "All this time, I thought I was alone, but she carried me with her." James sat down across from her, his expression tender. "Rebecca loved you, Natalie. That was never in question." Natalie looked up, her eyes glistening. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell you?" "She was scared," James said after a moment. "Scared of what it might change, or what it might cost. But she always believed in you. That's why she wrote those things. Because she knew one way or another, you'd find your way back." Natalie clutched the diary to her chest, her grip firm as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I miss her so much." "So do I," James admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think she'd be happy knowing we're here now, together." For the first time in days, Natalie allowed herself to smile, even through her tears. "She would. She always wanted me to have a family. And now you do," James said firmly. "This is your family, Natalie. Your home." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Natalie felt a small, steady warmth begin to grow in her chest. For years, she had wandered without purpose, haunted by memories of a life she thought was lost. But now, with Rebecca's words as her guide and James and Matthew by her side, She finally felt like she was finding her way. Natalie sat alone in the garden, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the perfectly manicured hedges and blooming roses. She cradled a cup of tea in her hands, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she stared blankly at the fountain in front of her. The quiet was soothing, but it also amplified the swirling doubts in her mind. The diary had answered many questions, but it had also stirred something deeper, an unease she couldn't shake. She had spent years believing she was on her own, and now, with James and Matthew offering her a place in their lives, she felt like an outsider in a world she didn't quite belong to. She glanced toward the mansion, its grandeur both beautiful and intimidating. "What am I even doing here?" she muttered under her breath. "You're doubting yourself again, aren't you?" Linda's voice broke through her thoughts. Natalie turned to see the housekeeper standing a few feet away, a soft smile on her face. Linda held a tray with a plate of cookies and another steaming cup of tea. Without waiting for an invitation, she set the tray down on the table and took a seat across from Natalie. "Is it that obvious?" Natalie asked, managing a faint smile. Linda chuckled. "It doesn't take a genius to see when someone's wrestling with their thoughts. I've worked for this family long enough to recognize it." Natalie sighed, setting her cup down. "It just feels overwhelming. James and Matthew have been so kind, but I can't help feeling like I don't belong here. This isn't my life." "Maybe it isn't the life you're used to," Linda said, pouring herself a cup of tea. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong. You're part of this family now, Natalie. James wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if he didn't believe that." Natalie looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I've spent so long trying to survive on my own. The idea of depending on someone else, it scares me." Linda's expression softened. "It's all right to be scared, but you're not alone anymore, James and Matthew. They're not expecting you to be perfect. They just want you to be here." Natalie nodded slowly, the weight of Linda's words settling over her. "It's hard to let go of the past." "I know," Linda said gently, "but maybe it's time to start looking toward the future." Then later that evening, Natalie found herself in the kitchen helping Linda prepare dinner. It was a simple task, but there was something comforting about it. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh herbs filled the air as she chopped vegetables, her hands steady despite her earlier turmoil. "You're a natural," Linda remarked. Linda, glancing over at Natalie. "Rebecca would have loved having you in here with her." Natalie's knife paused mid-cut, and she looked up. "You think so?" "I know so," Linda said with certainty. She always talked about wanting a sister around, someone to share things with. "I think she'd be over the moon to see you here." The thought brought a small smile to Natalie's lips. "I wish I could have been there for her." "You're here now," Linda said firmly, "and that's what matters." Dinner that night was a quiet affair, with just James, Matthew, and Natalie seated around the dining table. Matthew, as usual, filled the silence with his endless chatter about school and his upcoming science fair. "You're coming, right, Aunt Natalie?" Matthew asked between bites of mashed potatoes. Natalie blinked at the question, caught off guard. "The science fair? Yeah, you have to come. Dad said you'd love it." James looked at her, his expression hopeful. "It's next week. You should come. Matthew's project is shaping up to be pretty impressive." Natalie hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "I don't know. I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," James said firmly. "You're part of this family. Matthew wants you there, and so do I." Matthew nodded enthusiastically. "It'll be so cool to have you cheering me on." Natalie's heart swelled at the boy's sincerity, and she couldn't help but smile. "All right, I'll be there." "Awesome," Matthew exclaimed, beaming. After dinner, as Matthew headed off to bed, Natalie lingered in the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. James entered, 2 glasses of wine in hand, and offered one to her. "You looked deep in thought earlier," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Everything all right?" Natalie sipped her wine, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in all this." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You fit because you're family, Natalie. You don't have to prove anything to us. It's hard to shake the feeling that I'm disrupting your lives," she admitted. "You and Matthew had your own rhythm before I came along." James shook his head. Matthew's happier than I've seen him in years. And for me, having you here feels right, like it's something Rebecca would have wanted. Natalie's throat tightened at the mention of her sister. She really believed in family, didn't she? She did, James said softly. And so do I. You belong here, Natalie. I know it's not easy, but give yourself a chance to see that. For the first time in days, Natalie felt a small sliver of hope break through her doubts. She met James's gaze, her voice quiet but steady. I'll try. That's all I ask, James said with a smile, one step at a time. As the evening wore on, Natalie allowed herself to relax in the warmth of the Bennett home. The road ahead still felt uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she might actually be able to walk it. The sun rose gently over the Bennett mansion, illuminating the grand facade with soft, golden light. Inside, the house was already stirring with life. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen mingled with the sound of Matthew's excited chatter as he rushed through his breakfast. Natalie stood by the kitchen counter, sipping her tea as she watched him. "Aunt Natalie," Matthew called, his words barely intelligible through a mouthful of cereal. "Are you still coming to the science fair tomorrow?" Natalie smiled. "Of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Matthew grinned, his enthusiasm lighting up the room. "Great. You'll get to see how awesome my volcano is. Dad helped me perfect it last night. I'm sure it'll be the best one there," Natalie replied warmly. James entered the kitchen, adjusting his tie as he approached the table. "Matthew, slow down or you'll choke." "I'm fine," Matthew said, waving him off. "Besides, I don't want to be late. We have a practice run this morning," James chuckled, ruffling Matthew's hair before turning to Natalie. "Thanks for agreeing to come tomorrow. It means a lot to him." Natalie set her cup down, her expression soft. "It means a lot to me too." And the rest of the day unfolded with an unexpected ease. Natalie spent the morning exploring the mansion, familiarizing herself with its many rooms and hallways. She found comfort in small discoveries, like Rebecca's favorite books still sitting on the library shelves, and a framed photo of Matthew as a toddler on the piano in the sitting room by mid-afternoon. James suggested they take a walk in the garden. Natalie hesitated at first, but his casual demeanor put her at ease, and soon they were strolling along the cobblestone paths. "Matthew's really taken to you," James said as they passed a row of blooming hydrangeas. Natalie smiled, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "He's a special kid. It's hard not to feel connected to him." James nodded. "He reminds me of Rebecca in so many ways. Her curiosity, her determination. She would have loved seeing the two of you together." The mention of Rebecca brought a bittersweet ache to Natalie's chest. "I wish I'd had more time with her. There's so much I missed." "You're making up for it now," James said gently. "And I think that's what matters." Natalie stopped walking, turning to face him. "Do you ever feel like you're still carrying her with you? Like she's guiding you somehow?" James considered her question, his gaze thoughtful. "I do. Rebecca had this way of leaving her mark on everything she touched. On me, on Matthew, on this house. Even now, I feel her presence in the choices I make, and I think she's the reason you're here." Natalie's eyes glistened as she looked away, the weight of his words settling over her. "I hope I can live up to what she would have wanted." "You already are," James said, his voice steady. "You're here. That's all she would have wanted." That evening, James decided to host a small dinner in Natalie's honor. The idea was simple, to welcome her as an official part of the family. Matthew was thrilled, helping Linda set the table and choosing the centerpiece, a bouquet of roses from the garden. As they sat down to eat, James raised his glass, his expression warm and sincere. "I just want to take a moment to say how grateful I am that you're here, Natalie. For years, I thought our family was complete, but I see now that there was a piece missing. And that piece was you." Natalie felt a lump form in her throat as she raised her own glass. "Thank you, James, and thank you, Matthew. You've both made me feel like I belong. And I'm so grateful for that." Matthew beamed, clinking his glass against hers with a loud, "Cheers." The dinner was filled with laughter and stories, the kind that flowed naturally among people who felt at ease with one another. For the first time in a long while, Natalie felt a sense of peace, a sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Later that night, after Matthew had gone to bed, Natalie and James sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Natalie had a glass of wine in her hand. and James nursed a scotch as they reflected on the evening. "You didn't have to do all this," Natalie said, gesturing toward the now empty dining room. "I wanted to," James replied. "You deserve to be celebrated." Natalie smiled, but her expression turned thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" James asked, leaning forward slightly. "I want to help," Natalie said. "I don't want to just sit here and take up space. I want to contribute, to be part of this family in every way I can." James regarded her carefully, his respect for her growing. "You already do, Natalie, but if there's something specific you want to do, I'm all ears." "I've noticed how much Rebecca's presence still fills this house," Natalie said. "I want to honor that. Maybe I could help organize her things, turn her study into a space that reflects who she was." James nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I think Rebecca would have loved that." Natalie's smile widened, and for the first time, she felt a true sense of purpose. "Then that's what I'll do." As the night wore on, Natalie found herself standing by the window of her room, staring out at the city lights in the distance. The doubts and insecurities that had plagued her earlier seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. With James and Matthew by her side, she was beginning to see that home wasn't about the place. It was about the people. The following morning, Natalie woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The idea of transforming Rebecca's study into a space that celebrated her sister's life and legacy had given her a clear direction. After a quiet breakfast with Matthew and James, she asked Linda for help gathering materials from the attic and other parts of the house. The study, tucked into a corner of the mansion, was one of the brightest rooms, with tall windows that let in an abundance of natural light. As Natalie stepped inside, she took a moment to absorb the atmosphere. Every detail felt like a reflection of Rebecca's personality. The shelves lined with well-loved books, the writing desk cluttered with old stationery, and the faint scent of lavender that still lingered in the air. James entered a moment later, carrying a stack of boxes. "These are some of Rebecca's keepsakes. I wasn't sure what to do with them, but maybe they'll help with what you have in mind." Natalie smiled gratefully. "Thank you. This means a lot." He nodded, his expression soft. "Take your time. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." As the day progressed, Natalie began sorting through the items in the study. She found handwritten letters, photographs, and even small trinkets that Rebecca had saved over the years. Each discovery felt like a piece of a puzzle, helping Natalie understand more about the sister she had lost. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed Rebecca and James on their wedding day, standing beneath an arch of flowers. Rebecca's smile was radiant, and James looked at her with an expression of pure adoration. Natalie traced her finger over the image, feeling both sadness and gratitude. "She was so happy," Natalie murmured to herself. By mid-afternoon, Matthew joined her in the study, his curiosity piqued by the activity. "What are you doing, Aunt Natalie?" he asked, peering over the edge of a box. "I'm putting together something special for your mom," Natalie explained. "A way to honor her memory." Matthew's eyes lit up. "Can I help?" "Of course," Natalie said, smiling. "Here, why don't you pick out some of your favorite pictures of her?" Matthew eagerly dove into the box. Pulling out photo after photo, as he shared stories about each one, Natalie couldn't help but marvel at how vividly he remembered his mother, even though he had been so young when she passed. "She used to sing to me every night before bed," Matthew said, holding up a picture of Rebecca sitting at the piano. "I still remember the songs." Natalie's heart ached at the thought. "She loved you so much, Matthew. You were her whole world." By evening, the study had been transformed. Natalie had carefully arranged Rebecca's belongings on the shelves and walls, creating a space that felt both personal and inviting. A small table near the window held some of Rebecca's favorite books and a vase of fresh lavender, a nod to her favorite scent. James stepped into the room just as Natalie was putting the finishing touches on the display. He paused in the doorway, taking in the changes. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Natalie turned to him, her expression warm. "I wanted it to feel like her, a place where her memory could live on." "You've done more than that," James said, stepping closer. "You've brought her back into this house in a way I didn't think was possible." Matthew appeared behind him, his face lighting up as he saw the finished room. "Wow, it looks amazing," he exclaimed. "Mom would have loved this." Natalie knelt down to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's for all of us, Matthew. A place where we can remember her and everything she meant to us." That night, James suggested they hold a small memorial in Rebecca's honor. It would be a chance for them to share their memories and celebrate the impact she had on their lives. Natalie agreed, feeling a sense of closure beginning to take shape. The following evening, the three of them gathered in the study. James lit a candle and placed it on the desk, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. He spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Rebecca was the kindest, most selfless person I've ever known," he said. "She taught me what it means to love without limits, and she gave me the greatest gift of all. Matthew, I'll always be grateful for the time we had together." Matthew went next, clutching one of his mother's favorite books. "I miss her every day, but I know she's watching over us, and now, with Aunt Natalie here, it feels like she's still a part of our family." Finally, Natalie stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held Rebecca's diary. "I spent so many years wondering if Rebecca ever thought about me, if she ever missed me. Reading her words, seeing her life through your eyes, it's given me something I never thought I'd have: peace. She loved all of us in ways I'm still discovering, and I'll do everything I can to honor that love." As the candle flickered, a sense of warmth and unity filled the room. They stood together in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. For Natalie, it was a moment of healing, a chance to let go of the guilt and pain she had carried for so long. Later, as they prepared to leave the study, James placed a hand on Natalie's shoulder. "Rebecca would have been proud of you, of everything you've done." Natalie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, James, for everything." As she walked toward her room that night, Natalie felt a weight lift from her heart. For the first time, she truly felt like she belonged, not just in the house, but in the family, and she knew, deep down, that Rebecca's memory would guide them all forward. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. As Natalie stood by the window in the kitchen, the sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a warm glow on the breakfast table where Matthew was enthusiastically recounting his upcoming science fair presentation. "And then, when I pour the vinegar in, it's going to explode. Everyone's going to love it," Matthew said, beaming at Natalie. "I have no doubt," Natalie replied, smiling at his excitement. "You're going to steal the show." James entered the room, coffee mug in hand, already dressed in a sharp navy suit. "He's been practicing all week," he said, ruffling Matthew's hair. "I think we might have a future scientist on our hands." Matthew grinned. "Or maybe an inventor. Aunt Natalie can help me build cool stuff, right?" Natalie laughed softly, touched by his growing affection. "I'll do my best, but you might end up teaching me a thing or two." And later that day, Natalie found herself alone in Rebecca's study, now transformed into a space that felt like a sanctuary. The faint scent of lavender filled the room, and sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the carefully arranged mementos. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books on the shelf. Feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years, James appeared in the doorway, watching her silently for a moment before stepping inside. "You've really made this room something special," he said. Natalie turned to him, her expression soft. "It was already special. I just brought a few things to the surface." James nodded, taking a seat by the desk. "Matthew's been asking a lot about you lately, where you've been, what your life was like before." Natalie hesitated, her hands clasping together. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," James said, "that you had a difficult road to get here, but you're here now, and that's what matters." Natalie's throat tightened. "It still feels strange, being part of something like this. I spent so many years on my own, convincing myself I didn't need anyone." "You're not alone anymore," James said firmly, "and you don't have to carry everything by yourself. That's what family is for." Natalie looked at him, her eyes glistening. "It's just going to take time to really believe that, and that's okay," James said. "We'll take it one day at a time." And that evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Matthew brought out his project for one last practice run. The miniature volcano stood proudly on the coffee table, surrounded by towels to catch any overflow. "Ready?" Matthew asked, holding up the vinegar. "Ready," Natalie and James replied in unison. Matthew poured the liquid into the volcano, and the eruption of fizz and foam drew delighted laughter from all three of them. Natalie clapped, her laughter blending with Matthew's cheers. "You've perfected it," Natalie said, wiping a bit of foam from Matthew's arm. "You're going to blow everyone away tomorrow." "Thanks, Aunt Natalie," Matthew said, throwing his arms around her in a sudden hug. "You're the best." Natalie froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected affection. Then she hugged him back, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, Natalie found James in the study, reviewing papers by the soft glow of a desk lamp. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Got a minute?" she asked. James looked up, setting his papers aside. "Always." Natalie took a seat across from him, her hands resting in her lap. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for bringing me into your home, for letting me be a part of Matthew's life." James leaned forward, his expression sincere. "You don't need to thank me, Natalie. Your family. And if Rebecca were here, she'd say the same thing." Natalie smiled, a faint sheen of tears in her eyes. "I've spent so long feeling like I didn't have a place, but being here, with you and Matthew, it's changed everything." James nodded, his voice steady. "We're glad you're here, and I think Rebecca would be too." As Natalie left the study that night, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for so long. She no longer felt like an outsider, but a part of something greater, a family that was whole again, in a way she never thought possible. The next day, the science fair was a resounding success. Matthew's volcano stole the show, earning him a round of applause from classmates and parents alike. Natalie stood beside James, watching with pride as Matthew basked in the attention. "He's incredible," Natalie said, her smile wide. "He gets it from his mother," James replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "And maybe a little from you." Natalie looked at him, her eyes soft. "Thank you, James, for giving me a chance to be part of this." "You've always been part of it," James said. "It just took us a little while to find each other." As they left the fair, walking together under the warm afternoon sun, Natalie felt a quiet certainty settle over her. She was no longer wandering. She was home,